So turning to today's session, we are super excited to have Jen Spearline here. Jen has a very unique story in terms of how we met and how we got connected. So I will let her tell that story, but just what her topic is today in terms of how she's utilizing the extreme ownership principles to show up scared. That's what she's going to be talking about today, and a couple different experiences from her perspective and that she's gone through and the outcomes of those. And Jen also has a unique story. She's going to get into this a little bit too, but close to my heart is that Jen was also a college athlete. So we have that in common, and just a really awesome person to be here. Looking forward to her talk. As you all know, the chat box is open. So any questions that you have during the session, if you can just preface that with question in all caps, that makes it easier for us to find those throughout the session. And then any sit reps, any situation reports, any updates that you have that you want to share with the group, please feel free to also drop those in the chat. Again, sit rep in all caps makes us easier to find those. And we really enjoy reading about how you all are utilizing these principles, how you're applying them, the outcomes of doing that, and certainly any questions that you have throughout the session today. But without further ado, I will kick it over to Jen. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Jamie and Meg, both for the opportunity to talk to you guys today. I'm excited, and I'm a little bit of kind of a random guest speaker. So I know Meg alluded to this, and I'll talk some about how I ended up in front of you guys today, which is just kind of one of those funny stories that works out in life, I guess you could say. So a quick little intro on myself. So I am mom of two littles. So I have a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old, both girls. Our house is beautiful chaos of, activity, crying, laughter, whatever it may be that day, on every day. So wife to a husband who actually is just about to embark on a new job. So also showing up scared and getting ready to embrace the chaos that's about ready to start there. And then my day job, so to speak, is as an engineer with the military working on human performance. So there's been a lot of kind of, as I thought through and talked through kind of what I was going to cover today, there's really been a lot of experiences over the past 30-ish years, which is frightening to even think that it's been that long. But between sports, I was a walk-on in college and ended up playing 3.5 years or so, simply because it was time to get out of college. Moved a couple times up and down the East Coast, across the country as well. Switched career fields completely from chemistry into engineering. And then in that switch, started in grad school, which meant a whole lot of classes that I had really no background in, and teaching topics that I really was learning almost at the same time myself. And then also played club volleyball in college and then coached afterwards. So I think Meg and I definitely connected from that standpoint in terms of coaching, and I've definitely connected with a couple of stories that she's told over the years about coaching. So I've presented probably hundreds of times at this point in time in my career, both through school and professionally, but admittedly have never done a talk like this before, really. So up until now, I've typically been talking about the work. So what we've done, what we could do. It's always been sort of objective and outside of myself, if you will. And this is really talking about my kind of my mindset and a little bit of a different shift. Meg and I were talking in the pre-call that a lot of times with the women's assemblies, the focus has been on the extreme ownership principles, kind of in relation to other people, teammates, folks that work for you, folks that you work for, kids, husbands, that sort of thing, family members. And I think really what I'm going to focus on a little bit differently today is kind of that internal relationship. So that chatter that's in your head, that mindset that without knowing it, really the extreme ownership principles were at play as I was kind of moving through some of these scenarios that I'll talk through today. So I'm going to do a little bit of a backstory again about how I ended up here, and then go through probably 2 or 3 different examples and different instances through my life that have really resonated from the standpoint of they were moments that were utterly terrifying for a variety of reasons, and kind of how I continue to show up in those moments and afterwards, and again, using the principles, how they've played out, how I've learned from them, even in hindsight. And hopefully through that, there's some nuggets there that get shared for you guys. So the backstory. So this is, again, I'm kind of random, right? So I had been participating with the summit with the Women's Assembly for about a year and a half. And October of last year had just what was a ridiculous 2 weeks in our house. So we got back from vacation. We had a tree that fell on our patio. We had a fish tank that leaked in the family room. Dishwasher broke. Oldest daughter got medical diagnosis that was very, very manageable, but kind of life altering. And we had a lot to do with that. And then our youngest daughter decided to join the party and get this wicked stomach virus. And so for 2 weeks, it was just, it was the laws of combat. So it was truly prioritize and execute. So what needed to happen on that day, and how did we move forward? And so coming out of that, we got most of the stuff handled. And then I realized whenever I clued back into work that I had a presentation coming up that included travel. So the presentation itself wasn't ready. I thought it was, and it wasn't. So again, prioritize and execute, right? Take care of the home life, take care of the immediate travel plans are set, then start working on the presentation, and at some point sleep once you get there, and you'll be good to go. So got to the hotel in Atlanta and walked in, and funny enough, the Echelon front banner was up on the wall because the muster was happening there. And I think I showed up on the last day. I'm pretty sure I got there on the last day of the muster itself. But it was one of those moments where I just sort of chuckled. It felt like the universe was just kind of giving me like a little like, all right, you got here, you're good. And some of these principles like got you to this point, and, thumbs up type of thing. And of course I did what anyone would do, which was take pictures and, send them to your friends and say, look, there's a muster happening here. To which I had 2 friends that said, well, go talk to them. And I thought, well, that's absolutely ridiculous. I have nothing to say. These people are, they're at the end of a muster. I'm sure they're ready to go home, et cetera. And long story short, I ended up having to go back down into the lobby, realized they were all standing there, and then thought, well, I'm going to go say thank you to Meg and Jamie, because I really have enjoyed the Women's Assemblies tremendously. So it's been great to listen to over the past year and a half, not only professionally, but also blending the professional and the home life and kind of what that looks like. So I decided to go up and say hi. And so I think that was, it's funny enough, relative to the topic, I think that was kind of the first example of showing up scared and just saying, just put yourself out there to say hi and thank you. And then, go about your business. And that's the thing. So we started talking, and Jamie said, well, you should be a guest speaker. To which I really thought, again, it's ridiculous. Why would I do that? And then we ended up sort of exchanging information, and, I went about my business, was there for a different presentation, did my presentation, got home, et cetera. And afterwards talked to 2 of my girlfriends on the phone, and both of them immediately said, which I thought was really funny, both of them really said, well, you should absolutely be a guest speaker. Why wouldn't you? And I thought, well, because this is utterly terrifying. To which they both responded, but you're never scared. Nothing ever phases you. To which I really laughed, because all of these things scare me. All of these things have phased me. And, you just continue to show up though. So long story short, basically, here we are. We settled on the topic of talking about showing up scared. And as I started talking through and thinking through really the last, again, kind of 30-ish years between undergrad, professional life, and then into grad school, and now into both, again, professional life and also married life and mom life, there's been a couple of instances where really the principles of extreme ownership were at play for months leading up to a particular event, in ways that I just really didn't appreciate at the time, because the book wasn't out, the assemblies weren't happening, and all those sorts of things. But in hindsight, I can kind of look back and really see how they were at play. So I'll start with the first story, which goes back to, again, grad school for me. So there were two instances when I was in grad school that were do or die. So essentially, it was pass fail, and if you failed, they said thank you very much for coming, and now you can leave. And so we got through the first instance, or the first occasion of that. But the second one was at the end of the 5 years, where you were presenting everything that you had done, and everyone had to agree to pass. So there were 5 professors that were on this committee, and they all had to agree to this. So high stakes. You've invested 5 years. You've invested a lot of time. You've put in a lot of work. Have you done the right work? You don't know really at that point in time, right? And so this is where really, really kind of sitting back and taking that breath, and then starting to work through the principles was really, really beneficial for me. So, and this was over time. So there was one particular moment that I had to present, but truly looking back over the year to 2 years really leading up to that, all of the principles were at play at that point. So I think the first one was believe, right? So I had put together what I thought was the best information, the most accurate information. And I was confident from that standpoint of kind of what I had done. The second was checking my ego big time. So the faculty themselves were very senior, very experienced, very knowledgeable. But I also had a professor who told me at the time that no one else in the room is going to know as much about this project as you, which I thought was really, really silly. But what I realized was that I knew the intricacies, kind of what I had talked about or what I was going to present. And they had their own background that they were bringing to it. So I had to check the ego from the standpoint of there were parts that I would know and there were parts that I wouldn't know, and what those sort of balances were needed to be explored. The third one was simple. And this is something that has stuck with me forever, but you answer what is asked, and that's it. So you don't add to a question, you don't interpret the question, you don't feed anything else that your brain chatter may be telling you that you think the person is asking, but you just simply respond to the question that was asked and keep it simple from that standpoint. And the last two really were prioritize and execute. So what were the main aspects that needed to be covered that might be questioned? And then how do you execute on that particular part of it? If you know folks are going to ask those questions, are you prepared? And then the last one was really leading up the chain. And this was a big one. Rather than simply having the committee kind of puppet me, if you will, having those conversations with my committee members on a regular basis so that nothing was a surprise to them. They knew where I was coming from, they knew what the information was, and I had a chance to get that feedback from them early prior to the presentation, so that going into the presentation, essentially 90% of what was going to be asked or questioned maybe was already known. And I'll link back to this, to another principle within that in terms of leading up the chain. I think the other part is in those moments where you're having those conversations with the whoever is the superior, it's again checking the ego and believing and listening to what they're saying and being able to absorb that information. So if they had concerns, address them. If I didn't agree with them, it didn't necessarily matter in that moment in time, versus take those as homework and kind of move forward to address them. And then again, have those dialogues beforehand so that going into the dissertation defense itself, ideally you somewhat know the outcome at that point in time. It doesn't take the scared off of it, but it at least does help a little bit knowing that you're walking in somewhat prepared from that standpoint, and that you know that you've done the work to get to that point in time. The next story I'll talk about is more of a work one. So I was newly minted out of grad school and had been working, I had got assigned to a project that was kind of high profile, super fast paced. We had a lot of folks in and out that were sometimes in uniform, sometimes not in uniform. So we didn't necessarily know who we were talking to or what their rank was. And so you were kind of always on, you were always on your toes a little bit from that standpoint, because you just didn't know who was coming in. So we had a meeting that was coming up that we knew would be a little bit contentious. We knew there were a lot of differing opinions. There was potentially information being shared that wasn't going to be favorable or necessarily what folks wanted to hear, quote unquote. But we also knew that there was a basis for what that information was. And we had some kind of educated reasons for thinking what we did. But the meeting itself was very intimidating, right? So I'm kind of the new kid sitting at the block, or sitting on the table, at the table. Somebody mentioned before the call started that they were the only woman in the room. And in this particular project, for most of these meetings, I was the only female as well. And so that was kind of at play in the back of my head. So there was just a lot of moments where I kind of, I would have been very comfortable, I think, just kind of going, okay, I'm good, thanks. I'll see you all later. But really just decided to, in that moment, show up scared. And right before that meeting started, one of the guys that I was working with that was a lead looked at me and he said, remember, the guy, he's just a dude. And I thought, well, that's the most unhelpful and ridiculous piece of information I've received, so thanks. But what I realized in hindsight, I don't know that I realized it at the time. What I realized in hindsight was that in him saying that, that was really the moment that I started to detach. So I started to take the step back. I started to take the breath. I started to look at this objectively, that he was just a dude, and we were really just a bunch of people sitting around a table that were going to share some ideas. And in those moments, it kind of forced sort of this pause and breathe that then I think let all of us engage in a way that was objective at that point in time. So we went into this meeting, again, going back to the principles, we went into this meeting believing that the information that we had compiled was the best information that we could put together based on what we knew. And we were comfortable with that. Checking ego for sure. So we knew that there were going to be tough questions, and those questions weren't necessarily reflective of us individually versus questions about the topic, which is hard to detach from sometimes, because I know I get caught in thinking that if I have all of the right answers, then those questions either wouldn't get asked, or maybe they would get asked in a different way. And so checking the ego to allow for whatever those questions were. Again, keeping it simple. How can we put forward this information that potentially isn't favorable without making it overly complex? So convey that information and then pause and wait for the question. And again, decentralized command and cover and move in this case. So there were a bunch of us that were sitting at the table. We each had information, we each had expertise. And I think in that particular case, that meeting ended up being successful because there was a whole lot of cover and move happening. If one question was asked to one person, we knew enough of what was going on within the team that we could kind of kick that to the person that had better information. And again, I think that still goes back to checking the ego. If that other person is sitting there with more information, it doesn't say anything about you except for they have more information in that moment and they can convey that information and share it. So I think that kind of those combinations of, there's a weave, I guess you could say, that I've realized that happens with some of these principles in real time, that as you're kind of flowing through various aspects and various ways to address it, come to play. And I think overall end up helping everything be successful in the end. And then the last story I'll share is a little bit more of a comical one that I think Meg in particular will probably identify with. So I had I played volleyball in college, and I had a professor in college ask me to meet her for like a one-on-one office hour type of thing. And then showed up at her very small school. So everyone knew everyone at this particular school because there were only maybe about 1,000 of us total. So you were on a very, very close relationship with all of your professors. Showed up at her office and she said, well, let's take a walk. And I thought, well, this is weird. And what proceeded to happen for the next 30 to 45 minutes, if I remember correctly, was that she basically just called me out on all kinds of behaviors, attitude, all kinds of things that she didn't think were favorable. She didn't think served me well. She didn't think needed to happen, and she thought were really getting in the way. And of course, I did what any 21-year-old would do at the time, and assumed that she was completely wrong. And how dare her have these things that she wanted to convey to me. Went to practice that afternoon and found out that she had been talking with my volleyball coach, and the two of them had decided to enact this, I don't even know what you call it, like intervention or something. I don't even know what you call it, which then just made me even more mad because clearly both of them must be wrong. And so, time went on, and I can't say in this case that the extreme ownership principles helped me. I did not handle this well at all, knowingly. But in hindsight, those moments, that particular moment has stuck with me because I really think had it happened again, I would handle it differently. And I think there's two big things that come to mind really when I was thinking about the extreme ownership principles in this particular instance. One was checking the ego, clearly, that you were getting feedback that was delivered in a very objective way and in a very caring way. So both of them wanted me to succeed. I knew that. It came across that way. I just didn't want to hear it. And then the second really aspect of that is kind of once your ego has been checked a little bit, believe what they say, try it on and see if anything resonates, see if anything sticks. And funny enough, all of it resonated, all of it stuck, all of it made sense to me. But it was, again, just feedback that I wasn't really interested in hearing at the time. And then I think the outcome from that, the growth from that is really the prioritize and execute. So, of the feedback that you've gotten, what really seems to stick as the most important for you moving forward, and how do you focus on those things? And maybe over time, several of the pieces of feedback stick, and maybe over time you address several of those, but really in that immediate kind of acute period of time, I think in that case, the prioritize and execute is really helpful. And I had a same sort of experience too academically in that, again, in grad school, I was at risk of failing one of our required classes. And it wasn't for lack of trying. It wasn't for lack of interest. It was just simply a really, really hard class and a hard topic. And I had my professor at the time basically rank order all of us, put it up on a board and circle me at the very bottom of the list and say, whoever you are, you might want to think about something different. So not maybe the best way to give the feedback in hindsight, but the message was received from the standpoint of time to do something very, very different. And I do think in this case, this was probably about 15 years removed from the first instance. So maybe there was a little bit more wisdom that had been learned at this period. But I think in that case, I was able to, again, kind of check the ego. I knew I was failing. There was no question. This wasn't a surprise. But how do I address that? How do I get the help I need, prioritize and execute what I need to in order to get back on track? Again, keep things simple so that I can move forward and cover and move however I needed to. So I remember in this particular case, I had a roommate and a couple classmates that I could tag into to have them help me or them cover other things. And so kind of a small period of time, but also a really pivotal period of time from the standpoint of getting me forward in where I wanted to go ultimately. So I'll leave you with kind of one final thought and one little challenge, I guess you could say. In the past, couple of months, as I've been thinking about sort of what to cover today and what to talk about that would hopefully be beneficial for folks. There was a quote that I came across from Brene Brown that I thought was really funny, and it says, "The willingness to show up changes us. It makes us braver every time." And I think there's really something to be said there that I think you get better at showing up scared the more you show up scared. So in those moments you learn, in those moments you figure out how to apply the principles of extreme ownership and really kind of give yourself the foundation to take those next steps and move forward. And so along those lines, just kind of a final challenge, I guess, to everybody. But think back through a couple of times where you have shown up scared, or maybe not. How did the principles of extreme ownership kind of help you feel more grounded, feel more confident moving into those positions or into those situations? What would you do next time maybe to feel a little bit more empowered in terms of getting whatever you're looking for out of those particular instances? And I leave that challenge because I think, or I say that challenge because I think for me, it's been fun over the past couple of months to really think about some situations that could have gone very, very differently had I opted out of them, because the chatter in my head was screaming, "This is absolutely silly. Why are you doing this?" Versus, and really those situations have ended up being great opportunities, great growth, and something always that I've been able to learn and take forward. So with that, I'll kick it back over to you, Meg. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you all.
That was awesome. Thanks, Jen. Really appreciate your insights, sharing your story, some good humor in there, and I think all stories in different ways that we can relate to. So appreciate the connection. You mentioned, and I love the focus on internal. When we talk about extreme ownership, one of the core beliefs that we have at Echelon Front is that this leadership exists in all different capacities. It's not just at work. We don't just show up at work and turn on the leadership light switch, and then when we go home, we turn that thing off, right? We have leadership everywhere. It's at work, it's at home. Obviously, we talk about leadership a bunch at home. It's out in our communities. Anytime we're engaged with the community, that's an opportunity. And I think the focus on this session for leadership within ourselves. How can we utilize these principles within ourselves to show up scared, to do things that maybe wouldn't normally do, or things that are going to help us grow? How can we continue to grow that capacity within ourselves to be better leaders? And it's by applying these principles. So I really appreciate the different focus and the focus inward on this one. And when we focus inward, one of the biggest things that we have to be conscious of, and Jen mentioned this several times throughout her talk, is our ego. It is constantly talking to us. It is talking to us all the time. And it's saying stuff that it thinks is going to be helpful for us. It's saying things to, really, our ego is there to protect us. So it's saying things that it thinks is going to protect us. But our ego, unfortunately, is also very short-sighted. It's saying things in the moment that it thinks is going to protect us. It's not a long-term thinker. It doesn't think down the road of, hey, how could this help you grow and develop down the road? It's like, this feels very uncomfortable. Don't do it. that's the kind of chatter that our ego has. And that's the kind of perspective that our ego has. And I was on site with Dave recently, and we were talking about ego with this client, and he mentioned to the client and mentioned to every participant in that room, our ego is an idiot. And when you really think about it, because it is so short-sighted, certainly our ego can be helpful. And I think it has helped me accomplish some things in my life. It's helped all of us accomplish things in our life. But generally speaking, the majority of the time, our ego is there to protect us in the short term and is not thinking about the potential that we have in the long term. So our ability to recognize that, our ability to subordinate that, to check that in those moments when we know it's not going to be helpful, or when we know it's not actually what is going to be the best for us in the long run. So I really appreciate that aspect of it. So many good examples in there, Jen. And I also think you mentioned that the principles are interconnected. They are. And we talk about them in order, but we know that relationships are paramount. Everything starts from there. But as we think about decentralized command, that certainly goes back to relationships. As we think about prioritize and execute, our ability to do that is dependent upon being simple with our communication and being able to communicate effectively so that people understand what to do. So there's so much that's woven throughout the principles that really do help us be effective, that do help us show up scared in these moments when it is uncomfortable. And generally speaking, we don't like to be uncomfortable as human beings. We like sticking in that comfort zone. We like the predictability. We like all of that. And yet we know that that also is not going to be the most powerful, the most impactful thing for us if we want to continue to develop ourselves, if we want to continue to develop as leaders, as moms, as employees, as spouses, wherever we are in our life. So with the feedback, I got a kick out of the story just because coaching, you're always giving feedback. And feedback's one of those things that is, it's on a scale, right? Our feedback. But I think what was helpful, or what I heard from your story, is that your ability to take in that feedback was a lot about your relationships with your coach and was a lot about your relationships with your professor. You knew that those two people cared about you. You knew that they wanted to see success for you. And ultimately, they saw more potential in you than maybe you saw in yourself at that time. And
absolutely,
that doesn't make it any easier to hear that feedback. It doesn't make it any easier when someone's like, hey, I think you can be doing a better job at this. You're like, oh, whoa, I thought I was doing a great job. But when we take that time to check our ego, when we take that time to reflect, like, hey, coach just really wants me to get better. Coach is here to support me. They've shown that through various instances in our relationship, through various opportunities at practice, in games, whatever the case may be. But that relationship of cover and move and that relationship to your coach makes that feedback a little bit easier to then put into practice, because then we have to go out and do it. You can't just take that feedback like, oh yeah, that's a really good idea, I should probably start doing that. We got to take action on that. And we have to go and do those things if we want to get better, if we really want to maximize our opportunities in that way. And the last thing, I know we got some questions in there and some good sit reps and comments in the chat, but the last thing I think that Jen didn't say this directly, but she mentioned it a couple times, was in each one of these situations, in each story that she shared, certainly she was applying the principles and prioritize and execute. She mentioned that a couple times. And that was really about preparation. Her preparation heading into each one of those different situations allowed her, I think, to show up scared with a little bit more ease in doing that. When we feel prepared, when we feel like we have put in the time, and I think about this from a coaching perspective. If I take the time to practice and I am now confident in my ability to score a goal or to execute this play, I only get there through repetition. I only get there through preparation and through practice, so that when game time comes, I'm ready to execute on that thing. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to be 100% successful every single time, but I have the confidence to show up, even though it's uncomfortable, even though the pressure's on, the spotlight's on, whatever the case is, I'm feeling prepared. And that's that belief, that's that preparation, that's that showing up scared to say, hey, whatever the outcome is, I feel like I've done everything I can to put myself in the best position to execute on this thing. I don't have all the answers. It's not guaranteed 100% success, but whatever it is, I'm going to be able to manage it because I've put in the time to prepare, because I've done the things that I need to do and taken the steps that I need to take to be in a position where I'm comfortable talking what I'm talking about. I'm comfortable answering questions. I've had those conversations beforehand. So really tremendous amount of quality in what you said, Jen, and a lot of our ability to apply these principles just woven throughout your stories there. So really appreciate it. I could continue to go on and on and on, but I will pause there because I know that we have a couple questions, and I know there's one in particular that came through